Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and today I am deconstructing the Corsair 5000D. I'm actually on a mission to craft in the Corsair 2000D airflow, which is a very small case, much smaller than this. It's an ITX case, so that's actually going to be my first ITX build, and in that I'm going to be using a small form factor 1000 watt power supply, the SF1000L, along with a bunch of other stuff, a Gigabyte B650i Aorus Ultra, and a variety of things that are in here. So I need to take out the CPU, for example, the RAM, the NVMe drive, the GPU, and also the iCue Link system, because I'm going to use that in the 2000D, which is probably completely illogical, but I thought it'd be interesting to show if you've got a small form factor case, the iCue Link might be even more useful, because you won't need to worry about Corsair controllers, Commander Core, Commander Pro, whatever else you want to use. So that might make life easier. And that's all happening now. It's currently the 30th of August. I've just discovered that I've got an embargo to hit on the 7th for a completely different build. So I've got a lot to do. I've got a case to build this week, a case to build next week, and then actually another case to build the week after. And a lot of videos to produce in the meantime. So if you love PC build content, should be lots going on here. Subscribe if you haven't already, if you like seeing what I do. But in this one, it's all Corsair, so I think it'd just be interesting. It's going to be illogical. I think that'll be what people will say about that build in the 2000D airflow, is that most people probably wouldn't use the iCue Link system because it's probably expensive. I'm thinking if you go in ITX, you're probably trying to keep costs down as well as size, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Let me know in the comments what you think. Have you built an ITX case and want to keep your costs as low as possible? Just size is what's important. I've been thinking size and price, but maybe it's just a size thing. Maybe people like to cram expensive gear into a small thing. And I probably will be cramming expensive gear into a small thing, because I'm probably going to try and use this 4070 Ti, because I believe you can fit big cards in this case. And also, obviously an expensive power supply unit and reasonably expensive CPU. It's the Ryzen 7 770X DDR5 RAM, NVMe Gen 4 drive probably, and some other bits. I went to iCue Link, so it's going to end up being quite expensive, but in a compact build. But it's going to be my first ITX build, and I'm waffling loads now. The original plan was actually to use Lian Li's GA2 Trinity Performance 360mm radiator, because I haven't used that yet with the P20 fans throughout the case, but I've actually changed that plan because I'm going to use that in a different build, which is going to be more interesting next week, and of course they'll probably approve a 2000D, so stick with me now as I strip this down. Now, one of the fun things I know is going to happen here is I've got to uncable tie all the cables that I tied up on purpose. So if you've not seen this already, the build with the iCue Link, in that video I purposely cable tied everything because I wanted to make it really neat and show what a difference iCue Link would make. And it's basically one of the first times I've cable tied. And this is exactly why I don't cable tie, because now I'm going to have to snip all the cable ties and try and take it all apart really carefully without damaging anything, and then put it in a different case. It's going to take me ages, and it's not optimized for making videos as quickly as possible, but hopefully good quality ones nonetheless. So here we go. And this is an NVMe drive that just came out of this build, which I actually used for a previous video where I was testing to see whether you should take the stickers off NVMe drives. If you've not seen that already, go and check it out. I'll link to it in the description. But this is not something you should do. Actually, I found that removing the stickers doesn't help. Sometimes they're thermal stickers to help with performance, and removing them is actually not as useful as you might find. Also, you can see got thermal pads stuck to it from where it came out of the case, out of the motherboard, so something to keep in mind. But that's what's happening there. And I'm still going to reuse it because it still works fine. But don't do this. While I was taking things apart, I realised something. This is the motherboard I'm going to be using in the 2000D, the B650i, and what's interesting about this is that it has support for PCIe Gen 5 NVMe SSDs. Now, I've done a video previously on the FireCuda 540, which is a Gen 5 drive. And one of the things I was curious about then was this drive and the Crucial T700, which is another Gen 5 drive that I tested, are designed obviously very fast speeds. You get up to 10 gigabytes a second, 10,000 megabytes a second read speed and write speed on this. But one issue is if it gets too hot, it'll thermal throttle. Now, my question and potential video idea here is whether putting Windows on a drive like this is a good idea. If you put Windows on here and games and then run it off both, and it's like really intense and the airflow is not great, hopefully it is great, but does that then cause the drive to throttle to a point where Windows just crashes and your computer blue screens? Should you run a Gen 5 drive, which is super fast, as your main drive, or should you just keep it for games or less important things? So I'm going to do this build. I'm going to use this in here, which is not something I was planning on doing, but I think it would be a good video and a good test of what that's like. So subscribe for that if you haven't already. Let me know in the comments if you've even thought about this as a thing to consider. Obviously, I'm reusing the CPU for this build, so I'm extracting it from this motherboard to put it into the new one. While doing that, thermal paste problems, obviously, and I want to clean up the CPU and the pump. Although technically I'll be using the same pump and the same CPU, rejuvenating that thermal paste is going to be beneficial for properly testing things. Now, these are Noctua's wipes that are designed to take thermal paste off. They're obviously alcohol wipes, but you can buy them in multi-packs that I found really just useful to have hanging around because I'm obviously dealing with a lot of this a lot of the time, but I do recommend them. I might do a video soon on all the different things that I recommend for building, all the things that I use. If that'll be useful, hopefully that'll help people out. You can see these Ryzen CPUs are a pain. If you don't know already, the little notches on the side. If you've got any thermal paste spillage like I have, we've been a bit too careless, then that can be an issue there. Interesting, frustrating highlight to this design. Those same wipes can be used to clean off the CPU block. Interesting, this is the pre-applied thermal paste. You notice the spread hasn't been perfect. So if you do find temps aren't great on your CPU, maybe applying your own thermal paste to be beneficial. And obviously taking off the pre-applied thermal paste beforehand. I'm using Cryonaut for the build I'm about to do. So here it is. This is the back of the 5000D, which has been cable tied now. I was pretty clever about this from what I remember. So you'll see all the power cables are cable tied to keep them neat, but actually there's only a few that are actually hooked into the case. This one here, for example, is tied in there, but I think mostly otherwise I didn't go too crazy. I did this on purpose because I knew at some point I was going to have to take it apart. But I would suggest that maybe you don't use loops as well. So if you're thinking about cable tied and you decided that cable tie in your case is really important to you, maybe don't use the metal hooks on the case itself. There's another one up here, for example. You can see, if we look a bit closer, that this is going to prove difficult because these are obviously individually sleeved. I've got to try and cut through that tie without damaging the cables. I haven't done this across the entirety of the case. You might do fan cables and all sorts of other things, which are even more risky. But if you ever plan to use the same case and upgrade your fans or to upgrade your cooler or to do something else, then you might want to change out the cables. So actually tying them to the case doesn't always make sense, in my mind anyway. But you know, you can still make them neater. If you look at these on the 24 pin, for example, I've got multiple cable ties all the way along. It's just keeping it sort of bunched up, which then makes it thinner and more compact. But you can see this iCue Link system basically makes it really clean at the back anyway. I've taken the motherboard out, obviously, but otherwise I've left all the cables in place. And this is what it will look like in that build. Just really neat, very neat. This is the RM shift, which I've just taken out of there. This is the RM1000X shift PSU, which means that the Gen 5 cables actually come out the side. I'm also using the premium sleeved cables, which obviously have a nicer look and feel to them, and I've cable tied them, obviously, to make it neater. But I'm actually going to use this in another case, in a Lian Li case, where I want to show how it's possible to use this in other cases, but you do have to think about the logic of it, because obviously it comes out the side. Usually your power cables would come out of here, this end, that's the rear of the case, and then the cables come out this way, but these come out the side, which means potentially if you have a smaller case at the back where there's not so much room on this side, you've got more space for cables, or at least angles to run them, or maybe more length depending on it, and also maybe more room for your hard disk drive, because generally speaking a hard disk drive tray sits around here, so your power supply goes in there, then the cables come up here, which means that they're then blocking the PSU. You can see there would be a cage here, cable would probably be a problem. Where they come out the side like this, they can just run straight up and into the various different directions. Great in the 5000D, but won't work in every case. But what I am going to do is try and use this in a V&D case soon, just to see how that gets on. So this is the Corsair SF1000L. This is a small form factor power supply unit with Type 5 PCIe connectors, which means they will work with small, so these are small compact cables, the smaller pinouts, and also this is designed to work with the 40 series GPUs, so it also comes with the 600 watt cable included as standard that will work with 40 series. But what I think is interesting is just the sheer size of the thing. So this is 1000 watts, and this is the RM Shift 1000. So you see the size difference. So they've crammed a lot of technology into a very small frame. You see the fan, obviously smaller, more fins. Hopefully it keeps cool under load. But it's interesting, just the size difference on the thing. Like how usually you can only get like 800 watts, I think. 800, 850 watts in a small form factor, so it's pretty interesting to see a Diddy 1000 watt. And that's basically down to the requirement of modern GPUs running so much power. So obviously this will supply enough power for the Gigabyte 4070 Ti, and it has the right connectors for it, so you don't need to use that adapter. So it's got that new 40 series adapter, which is a pain. But with that cable, you can use this tiny PSU and that graphics card and no problems. Very Diddy, pretty cool. For more comparison's sake, here's that Gigabyte motherboard. So this is ATX motherboard, which is equally Diddy. So the PSU is actually smaller than the motherboard. It's just nuts. Here is quite an intimidating setup, or at least quite a bit different from the usual motherboards I'm used to building. So I'm usually doing ATX motherboards, and although this is smaller, it's actually a bit more complicated, which is interesting. So if you're thinking about doing an RTX build and you haven't done before, I'm going to point out a few things of interest here. So the basic setup, obviously the motherboard is fairly straightforward. You've got 2 slots for RAM, so not a problem, 24-pin power supply cable and a 8-pin CPU cable, and then you've got a PCIe connector here. This board actually supports several NVMe SSDs, Gen 5 and Gen 4. And one of them's hidden under here, and there's a fan that's connected to a system fan header that's actually designed for cooling the NVMe drive, which is actually going to be pretty interesting because I'm going to put a Gen 5 drive in there and see what the temps are. The other one is on the back here, so you have to remove all this back plate in order to access the other port, which is here. The other thing that's interesting is buried inside there, which you can't see, is the Intel Wi-Fi card. So you have a Wi-Fi adapter. Other curiosities are just the sheer number of cables that you get. Now you usually get a few different cables with motherboards, but generally you don't have to use them. For example, SATA cables here for connecting up to SSDs and hard disk drives. Probably won't use those. You also have some fan cables here which connect up, and these basically give you the ability to connect system fan headers, which are severely lacking on here otherwise, right? That's what's interesting. Obviously, with an ITX board, you're unlikely to have very many system fan headers anyway, which is fine. So, and I'm going to be using the iCue Link system here, so it shouldn't matter too much. Got a CPU fan connector at the top, but no AIO pump connector. There is a CPU optional connector, but that is actually somewhere else. Now, the other thing that's interesting here is this little card. So this card isn't pre-installed, and that's curious in itself, because if you look, that's got the SATA and our disk drive connections on it. Well, okay, maybe you want to use those, that's fine. But you'll also notice there's multiple other connections. We have an RGB connector on there, for example, and then a front panel connector and a system fan header. So this is where those cables plug into. So this sys fan header cable, for example, that plugs in there and then gives you the connection for that. Because you'll notice this isn't a standard fan connection. This is. So you'd have to connect that cable up. So you do need discard if you plan on using system fans. The other thing you'll notice is you have this front panel connection here, and that's because we've got this front panel cable which has all the connections you'd need on it, and obviously that's going to plug in there. So these are sort of additional things. So not only have you got to plug this card in, you've got to plug these extra cables in if you want to use front panel connections for power and reset buttons and other things, and also system fan header, and then an RGB connection. So we also have an RGB extension cable if you need it, and a 12 volt RGB header. No sign of the 5 volt on this card, so that's interesting. Might present a problem if you want a 5 volt RGB header. I can't, oh, there is actually one, I stand corrected. There is one on the motherboard. It's right at the bottom down there, so there is a 5 volt RGB header down the bottom there. The other thing we have here is this USB cable. So this is the internal USB connections. So this cable is required, basically it's an extension cable, that plugs in here. Again, sort of standard down the bottom connector, but that's going to be necessary to connect up the iCue Link system, obviously. It's nice because it gives an extension lead to it, although I've got to work out how to run it past the GPU, so that's going to be a challenge because that's the PCIe bracket port there, and then obviously I've got to work out how to run this cable round it, maybe this way. Not much length in it, but that'll be fine, I think. We'll see. So you actually have to plug in a lot more things. So this card, for example, has to be plugged in here. I haven't pushed it all the way in yet because I want to demonstrate that in a minute, but basically that's how that works. That connector goes in there. You can only connect it up one way apparently, but if you want to use all these other things, like simple things like a reset button, a power button, a system fan header, 12 volt RGB header, you need an extension card, which is mad. That said, if you're not using those things, there's a power button connection on here and the reset switch as well. So theoretically you could just connect that and you wouldn't need to connect this adapter. As you see, there's markings on it for speaker, power switch, power LED, hard disk drive, reset switch, and the power LED on the other side. Difficult to read, but it's in the manual as well. And then color coded to make life easier potentially. But maybe you don't even need to worry about that. I don't really know yet. So you might not need this card unless you're using system fan headers. And I don't think I am going to be, but I am going to have to talk about it in the motherboard video and also just when I'm covering the build, because I think it'll be worth it because people might not be using the same gear or they might want to do other things. I'm not going to use hard disk drives in this build, for example. Well, I still need to talk about it. We do have USB-C and standard USB-A connections on there though, so that's a bonus. And then I've got AM4 sort of style brackets on there at the moment, which I need to take off. So lots of things to show, but a curious design. Now I've got to work out where I'm going to start, what I'm going to talk about. So a few things of interest about the 2000D immediately I'm going to talk about. So one of them is it comes with these RGB fans installed as standard. These look like AF120 RGB Elite fans, and indeed the documentation suggests that they are that, although one of the other documents says that they're slim, and they do look a little bit thinner. I'm going to take them out and find out. They also notice that they've got fan grill backing, which is pretty interesting. I'm going to remove those. Inside and pre-installed are these controllers. Now this is for fan power and RGB. It gives you power for 6 fans, both fan power and RGB control, which is obviously awesome as a pre-installed standard thing. However, I've taken them out because I'm going to be replacing it with the iCue Link system. And obviously as standard, these require a few different cables. So SATA power, system fan header from the fan controller, and then from the RGB controller, more SATA power and a USB connection. Those are now gone. And obviously I'm also going to remove these AF120 fans which means I'm ditching all these other cables. We've got fan power and RGB from each of those, so that's 6 cables from 3 fans. Then for SSD mounting, that's another point of interest. The case is able to take SSDs in 3 places from what I can see. It comes with 1 tray though, so it's worth noting that. So this tray is pre-installed in here, and that's where you can put it back. Alternatively, you can move it further up. And it looks like there's mounting points at the top here. 4 points you'd screw in through the roof to mount the SSD there instead. Now I think that actually might be a better option, because it looks like this is the power supply unit shroud, the area where that mounts, and this would be where the fan is for that, and I'm blocking it. At least I think it is. I'm not 100% sure on that. I'm going to find out. Then I've got other cables. Now other points of interest here is this is able to take 320mm fans. No, 2 fans, sorry. It's able to take 2 extra fans. You can mount a 40 series GPU in here, up to 3 slots. You can see the mounting points here. Now this is going to be fairly interesting, because this is how it will sit. So these are the feet down the bottom here, for example. So the graphics card runs down here, and then your cables need to plug in down here, which is going to be fun, isn't it? You've got to route your cables up through the bottom and plug them in, so your DisplayPort HDMI cable runs that way. You then also have all these different cable ties on the outside for sorting your cables out, and there, same sort of logic. It's certainly going to be an interesting build for various different reasons. And the other thing that's interesting is the manual suggests there should be a 120mm fan mounting point either up here or on the bottom. It says top mounting, but then the manual shows a diagram of the bottom, so I'm a bit confused as to where that's meant to go. But I don't see any potential for mounting a fan there either, on either of them, because there's no spot for doing so, so I don't really get that. It's a bit of a weird one. But still, some nice inclusions as standard. For the price you're getting these controllers, so you don't even need a commander. You could potentially go for an air cooler, a small profile air tower or something, and then onto a winner, or obviously a 360, up to a 360mm radiator. That's installed on this one, a fan tray, which either gives you the option for a radiator mounting or for a bunch of fans. So obviously 120mm fans or 140mm fans, depending on the setup. So loads of interesting things going on here. Future Prawn here. Apologies for the random changes in audio. Obviously I've been using Shure mic and Rode mic, mixing between those. I've also got a bit of a cold at the moment, so I'm sounding a bit more gruff. But anyway, I want to talk about some other things of interest. So I just mentioned top fan. So if you look over here, for example, you'll see this is the 2000D website. Now, if you go over here currently, I want to say currently because they might well change it, because I have pointed them out to Corsair. And if you go there and then download the manual, you'll see if we then scroll through, there's a little indicator over here about a fan that sits on top. And I was so confused by this, because obviously this is a guide on how to do it, and you can see this fan in multiple places. And it also talks about installing it a bit further down. Here we go, installing the top fan. And it says top, and it shows the top. But as you've seen from these shots, that L-shaped bracket is not there. That's actually on the bottom. And the fan is definitely not there. And the PSU is actually shown as being in a different position. And so are the controllers. So I was like thoroughly confused by this initially. I obviously just went about building based on my own logic, but if you downloaded the manual and then looked through here, you'd be mighty confused as to why it's suggesting you could put a fan where there is no space for a fan. There's literally a solid panel there where it's suggesting. But it turns out I asked Corsair about it, and this is actually a manual for a case, or a version of the case that they didn't release. So they just failed to update the links on the website. So if you have downloaded the manual, then that's why. And if you're struggling with the build, go check out my build guide, because I've done a full installation build guide on this. Obviously, this is a behind the scenes look at various things that I found along the way. Now I want to talk about a few other things as well, so other discoveries. I'm going to do separate videos on most of these things. Well, I'm going to quickly cover some of the points of interest in it. So one of the things I found is during the installation process, obviously I've got an ITX motherboard installing in this case, and I'm using different fans. So I'm using the Corsair iCue Link fans in place of the low profile slim AF120 fans. So they are slimmer, and I have shown that in the build guide. The result of this is a little bit problematic. So you can use bigger fans, but actually what I found is I use the iCue Link fans, so the QX120 fans, with the backing on them, so the protective shrouding around the outside of the trays, which is obviously designed to stop cabling from being caught in the fans. So it makes sense to take them off the AF120s and put them on the Corsair fans, on the QX120s, or any other fans that you're planning on using. And then that will protect the motherboard cabling and other cabling that's in there from getting stuck in the fans, which we wouldn't want. The downside to this is that I then found that the motherboard wouldn't then fit in the standoffs because the fan's thicker, and obviously you then also got that tray there. I did manage to get around it by removing one of the screws, but then I jam the motherboard in there, and I've probably bent the IO shield at the very top of it just a tiny bit. Not ideal, but something to think about. So if you are planning on building a 2000D, just keep that in mind. That replacing the standard fans, you maybe want to think about thinner fans or risk having a squashed motherboard. Small problem, but one of interest. Other things I've discovered is that you can put the outer doors on the wrong way around. So when I went to finish it off, I actually put the left door on the right hand side and the right door on the left hand side, and they will fit. And it's not obvious you've done that wrong until you try and put the top on, and then the lid won't go back on because the notches on that don't line up. It took me a minute to work that out. Stupid little things like that. If you look at the build guide, you'll also see a lot more detail on sort of the installation of the motherboard. For example, I found that cable routing was a bit of a pain because you have to run the cables for the front panel connections, for example, above the motherboard underneath the fans, and there's not much space there. I actually ended up taking out the motherboard multiple times and then reinstalling it, which was super fiddly and problematic. I did get around that in the end though, because you can run it over the top and then round the corner there. After I built it, I also found that the CPU was running really hot while idling, and I thought maybe this was down to me not seating the CPU cooler down properly. I hadn't tightened up the thumb screws because that sometimes happens. So I checked, and that was indeed the case, but actually it's still running hot. I'm looking for a fix on this. I did update the BIOS. You may well be aware of the problems with AMD AM5 motherboards and CPUs. There was mention by Gamers Nexus a lot on those CPUs overheating because of the voltage controls on Asus motherboards, but other motherboards may well be prone to it. I noticed when looking at the Gigabyte website that my BIOS was massively out of date. Basically, I had the original version on there, and there's been about 7 versions since there. So I updated the BIOS, and it has helped a little bit, but I'm still running a little bit hot, and I'm not 100% convinced whether it's the case. So I don't want to say right now this case has bad airflow, or don't use iCue Link with it, or whatever else. I'm going to save this for the review. I want to go into a bit more depth on it. But I would say if you are copying my build or doing something similar, especially with AM5, make sure you update the BIOS on your motherboard, because the voltage controls might well be affecting the performance and the heat of the CPU. Other weird things I have found is that iCue Link started flashing red. Randomly, the fans will flash red during gaming, and a little search up on this shows it's actually a firmware problem. It's reporting a false positive problem of issues with the voltage controls that's being detected by iCue, and then it flashes the lights red on the system as a warning. I initially thought that this was an overheating problem. When I checked the temps, they were fine. And then I also went into looking at what was going on with it, and a quick Google search revealed that it's a known issue. So I'm going to do a video on how to fix that, because I figure that most people that got iCue Link and have that issue will want to know what the answer is. Very sort of distracting problem where you've got flashing red lights on your case for what isn't actually an issue. It was especially obvious in that build. The other thing that's interesting is I have, as I said, installed the operating system on the iCue 540. I can confirm that both the P5 Plus NVMe SSD that I installed on there and the iCue 540 are running with the standard amount of lanes. So I've got Gen 4 speeds on the Crucial drive and Gen 5 speeds on the Seagate iCue 540. And that little cooling fan is actually surprisingly good. So I did some benchmarks. I'm going to do a video separately on this, talking about whether you should install Windows on a Gen 5 drive. But the quick overview of that is that it's actually working okay. Put games and Windows on it, and I did some benchmarking, Crystal Disk Mark, and other sort of heavy load testing on there to make sure. And the thermal performance of the drive itself was actually really good. It was pretty low. It wasn't over the top, so that was great. So I've got a lot of potential videos coming out of this. BIOS updates for the motherboard review, case, build guide. Obviously I want to do a case review and I'll spend a bit more time on it, PSU guide, and some other bits, other fix for the iCue Link system as well. So lots of different content coming out there. I will say it's a nice looking case, and it was actually surprisingly good to build in. I really thought the mini ITX build was going to be an absolute pain. I've always sort of dreaded it because I'm pretty clumsy and I've got fairly large hands, so they're problematic in terms of accidentally getting your sort of hands scraped. You might have well seen cuts on my hands from previous builds. But actually, it was a lot better than that. It didn't really have problems there. The only problems I've got is the thermal performance, and I think I'm not quite sure what the issues are there, but I also do think that the cabling is becoming a problem, and maybe if I'd cable tied it would be better, which obviously most people would do, but I'm not going to because I'm probably going to strip out that entire system at some point to build another case. But it is interesting to be able to test these things out. It is also quite loud. I found it is running quite loud, but then that's not a surprise because compact case, the airflow is not as good as a larger mid-tower or full tower case. Anyway, hopefully this has been some interesting insights into the 2000D airflow and what I found along the way. Be sure to check out the build guide if you're interested. Subscribe if you haven't already, and come back and watch the review and the other videos I talked about, because there's lots going to be happening here. Thanks very much for watching. You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos, you might well find them interesting or useful, and most importantly, have a great life.